Greetings, everyone. This is Jyoti Dodia. Welcome to today's Power Technical webinar series virtual user group session. This is the 104th in the series, and replays for all past sessions are available. I'm delighted to have Vess Natchev deliver the session for us today, and today's topic is going to be networking and admin best practices for Power Virtual Server in the IBM Cloud. I've known Vess quite a long time. We used to run some technical enablement sessions face-to-face when that was allowed many years ago. But today's session obviously is virtual. So without further ado, over to you, Vess.
Thanks very much, Jody, and thank you for having me. Obviously, this is a long series of presentations. I'm happy to join the lineup and speak with everyone today. So I recognize a good number of the names, so it's a pleasure to speak with you again. For those of you with whom I haven't spoken before, so a bit of intro, so you know who's speaking to you today. So as Jody said, she and I have worked overtime for a long time now. I've been with IBM about 20 years myself, and I am in the IBM Lab Services organization. So we have been known as lab-based services or IBM Systems Lab Services, but we are an organization that helps all of our clients and partners, of course, and other IBMers get the most value out of both brand new kind of leading edge solutions, and that's some of the solutions that my team works on, as well as solutions that our clients, all of us here have been using for a long time. There's a good chance you've got experience working with your local lab services person already, but if you don't, that's kind of what the organization is. So within lab services, I lead a Power Cloud team. Our job is to help all of us here implement all of our cloud solutions as it relates to our power systems. This team's been around for about 10 years now, and we've evolved as the solutions have evolved. But our mission has stayed the same, which is what I was stating before about working with all of us here to hopefully get the most out of these solutions. Some of our key solutions we work with today, not an exhaustive list, would be Power Virtual Server, and that's our topic today. We also do quite a bit of work with OpenShift on Power. We do quite a bit of work with Ansible on Power. We do quite a bit of work with PowerVS on Power, being our on-premise cloud provisioning solution. So for all of those solutions, my team works with clients in North America. I also have the privilege to work with our worldwide lab services team and collaborate on all of these Power Cloud solutions. So right away, I will say a little towards the end, I'll spend just a few minutes telling you about specifically how we in lab services help clients with Power Virtual Server. And right away, let me invite you, if you by chance don't know who your local lab services person is, I do. And so you can reach out to me. My email address is right there. I work with those well-qualified women and men around the world every day, so I can tell you who they are, and they can help you with what we're talking about here or anything else in the Power Cloud domain of solutions locally. So I invite you to do that. So without further ado, now you know, having a bit of an idea if you didn't before, who's talking to you. So again, it's my pleasure, and we will dive into today's presentation by looking at the agenda briefly. So my goal today, as I say, what we in lab services do is we work with these technologies and with our clients, partners, and the rest of IBM daily. That is our day job. We also spend quite a bit of time working with IBM development, and so we're very closely connected to the IBM lab. That's where lab services came from, okay? So with all of that in mind, my goal will be to give you a bit of a review of our capabilities in Power Virtual Server in these two main areas, which is networking and then also administration, which is how we manage what it looks like to manage AIX, IBM I, SAP HANA, a bit of OpenShift, in Power Virtual Server. I'll mostly be covering I will call them the LPAR, VM on Power, the LPAR-based workloads in Power Virtual Server. If you have an interest in OpenShift in Power Virtual Server, very much a available and fast-growing technology, you can always connect with me and we can do a follow-on session. So because we have that relationship with the lab and because our day job is working with clients, partners, and the rest of IBM, I will give you that review, but I will also share our experience with you. And just like Jody did, I invite you to ask as many questions as you like in the chat. I won't go for more than an hour, meaning we will have half an hour to go through all those questions that hopefully you will have. So as I say, that first area of interest is going to be networking with Power Virtual Server. And I will go through some of the most common scenarios. Not quite every single last one, because there are definitely permutations there, but I will go through a few of them. And again, tell you when and how they will be applicable, advantages, disadvantages. I will talk a bit about what it looks like to do the initial setup in Power Virtual Server, and again, share our experience with you. And then we will talk a bit about when I am managing some of my, again, IBM AIX, Power workloads in Power Virtual Server. What does that look like? And how does that compare with what my existing experience may be on-premise? Because as you can see here, as I know you've been hearing, Power Systems is very firmly in the hybrid cloud world, both on-premise, public, and solutions based on OpenShift and Cloud Paks that span both. And today's focus is a bit more on the public side of things, Power Virtual Server in the IBM Cloud. And as I say, at the end, briefly, this is not meant to be a sales job, although briefly I will tell you, if you're wondering how lab services, what are our vehicles to help you with Power Virtual Server, I will speak briefly on that as well. One comment I'll make before I start is I've put together more slides than I will present. That's a typical practice that we do. Of course, you'll get access to this presentation deck. Of course, there's nothing confidential in it. And so I like to start at a maybe intermediate level. As Jody said, there's a previous presentation that introduces Power Virtual Server in general, so I won't spend too much time on that. But I do try to build things fairly gradually, because what I've found in my daily work with all of you is that Power Virtual Server been around for some time now. Certainly have lots of clients running in Power Virtual Server around the world. But everyone is coming from a different level of knowledge. So there may be a few things that you knew already. Bear with me. I'm fairly confident I'll get to things that you might not have run into before, whereas meanwhile, someone might not have some of those more basic things. All right, so we'll proceed with, and I will just do a couple of maintenance things here. So, yeah, go ahead, Jody.
I was just going to remind people that we are taking questions at the end, and to just make it clear what topic you are referring to in the question when you type it into the chat window.
All right, excellent. And so, before we get into the larger topics of networking and then what it looks like when I'm running my Power workloads in IBM Cloud, I did want to share with you a set of questions. It's a basic set of questions that we use when we're working with the client, when we're working with one of you, when we're working with client, partner, IBMer, on starting to plan for, starting to think about Power Virtual Server. So as I get into these questions, let me just say one sentence, just in case maybe you didn't have a chance to see the previous presentation that Jody had put in as a suggested reading, if you will. So very briefly, just in case you didn't have some of that initial knowledge. So Power Virtual Server, co-located with IBM Cloud, is our solution for running Power workloads, as I say, AIX, IBM Linux on Power, including SAP HANA, and OpenShift on Power, co-located with the IBM Cloud. And we have both scale up and scale out systems available, and they use flash storage and so on. And so you get some of the best that the Power platform has to offer consumed in a cloud model using cloud.ibm.com and so on. So with that quick preview, just to make sure that no one is lost, we'll delve into a few more of the specifics. So as we look at potentially moving one more of our, a portion of our Power workloads to IBM Cloud to start taking advantage of this hybrid cloud model, what are some of these questions that we use? So first off, workload identification. So what are some of the best candidates for moving to the IBM Cloud? And again, the idea here, you're talking to a Power person. So I'm not advocating for one particular part of the hybrid cloud. So to me, we work with clients on the public side, the private side, on-premise side, and across the hybrid cloud. So I don't take this as a full advocation of, yes, we must move all of our workloads to the public cloud. It's all based on business need, what business challenge I'm trying to solve, and to what extent, which part of the hybrid cloud is solving that challenge. So as we're identifying workloads, so of course, we're going to look at business criticality. So how business critical is the workload? Obviously, the more business critical it is, the more careful we have to be, and the more challenges that we will have to resolve. And we do know how to resolve them, but the more challenges will be with moving that workload to the public cloud and to Power Virtual Server. And so, of course, we're going to look at the recovery time objective. We're going to look at recovery point objective for these workloads. How much of an HA, availability disaster recovery requirement they have. And so, of course, we tend to start with test and dev and UAT and so on, QA and such workloads. But that's not to say that we don't have production workloads, both AIXI running in the public cloud as well. Just we're looking at the proverbial low-hanging fruit to start with, prove out the process, identify challenges, and typically this process very much proceeds in stages. So there might be a POC stage, and then we move a few more workloads, and then a bit more larger scale, if again, that's where my business direction is. So we have quite good documentation. Nothing is ever perfect, but quite good documentation, I feel, on Power Virtual Server. And there's a link in there that I've included, and that link is to the frequently asked questions. And if you've never been to that part of the cloud documentation that's dedicated to Power Virtual Server, again, I would say it's fairly good, a good number of topics, both general as well as I and AIX specific. I've linked the frequently asked questions, and by starting from there, you can investigate the rest of it. When you get to topics such as migration to Power Virtual Server, or how backups would work in the Power Virtual Server, you'll see a good bit of documentation. And then you would also see links to some more in-depth tutorials that our team, the Lab Services team, actually wrote by request from the offering team, the Power Virtual Server offering team. So good bit of documentation. And one specific point that I want to draw your attention to there is the minimum versions of the OS. Now they are, I would say, fairly generous. So if we're talking AIX, we're talking AIX 7.1 and obviously 7.2. And if we're talking IBM, maybe you saw that we are starting to roll out IBM 7.1 as well. And obviously we've been supporting 7.2 and later this whole time. And so we're in the process of rolling out support for IBM 7.1 as well across the different PowerVS locations. Sometimes those PowerVS locations, because they are co-located with the IBM Cloud, you might hear them referred to as the colos around the world. And of course, there are 2 in London, and there are 2 in Frankfurt, and there are obviously some in North America, and some in Japan, and Australia, and Sao Paulo, and others, and those are growing. And so what that means when we're talking about OS requirements is that part is relatively straightforward. What might not be as straightforward is application dependencies. on those versions of the OS. And so as we work with all of you on Power Virtual Server, one key part is going to be obviously getting that inventory of the OS versions, but then tracing that down to, okay, if by chance I do need to upgrade my OS, what's the implication for my applications? And which ones are homegrown versus which ones are ISVs based? Is the ISV still in business? What is the ability to upgrade if needed, and what's that effort? Network architecture and design, I won't spend too much time here because the very next set of slides is on networking here, but of course that's the key part of it. And so some of the key questions that drive the design, you'll see them expressed in the network scenarios that I'll cover in a bit here as well, would be, what type of access do I need? And that's an area, and I'll explain what I mean. That's an area that we tend to intently focus on because often it takes a bit of exploration. Even if I'm a client, it might take me a bit of exploration within my own teams to find out. I'll pick, I will keep switching between AIX and IBMI examples. These solutions are cross OS and cross workload, and that's how my team works as well. So let's pick an AIX application. It may take a bit of exploration to find out what are all the different teams, as well as what are all the different applications and other systems that may need access to that system. And what does that mean if that workload were to go to the cloud? So what types of cloud connections will I need? From how many locations? How fast and how much bandwidth will they need based on what else is typical of that workload? Is that workload then being replicated to on-premise? Obviously, that's going to affect the bandwidth and latency requirements, right? Is it part of some multi-tier application stack? That will also affect the latency requirements. So those are all questions that we dive into quite deeply.
Vess?
And since, yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. A couple of people are saying that they're not either not seeing slides or that it's frozen on the first slide. The one that I am seeing at the moment is the key questions and planning topics for migration services.
That should be the one. Yes.
Yeah, that's the one that everyone should be seeing.
And
it's working for many.
Yeah.
Yeah, so carry on. I think it seems to be working for most people. It's just 2 or 3 are having issues. So apologies.
You can see me test. You can see
Yep.
me test flip through. Yeah.
Yep. That's gone. Yep. That's back to where we were. Yep. Carry on.
Okay, so I'll keep going with the key questions. Yeah. So the last topic that we'll briefly touch on here are of course the high availability disaster recovery requirements. So typically those are pretty well defined within the on-premise environment, be it IBMI or AIX. And so then the question is, how do we translate that to Power Virtual Server in the IBM Cloud? One quick comment, you've heard me say both co-located with the IBM Cloud and in the IBM Cloud, and the official way of stating that is co-located with the IBM Cloud, which is both legally correct and technically correct. And so those are these PowerVS environments that contain many power servers, flash storage, redundant fabric storage, and network fabrics. Those are co-located with the IBM Cloud. And sometimes it's on the same data floor, but in different racks. Sometimes they're in a separate secure cage and so on. And the reason I know that is that our lab services team has also been building those PowerVS locations around the world, including the ones in the UK and Frankfurt and other places. So that's the official way to say it, co-located with the IBM Cloud. If I slip and say Power Virtual Server in the IBM Cloud, well, bear with me. Now you know what I really mean. Let's proceed with some of these network scenarios and talk a bit about, I'll give a bit of background on the network connection in general in Power Virtual Server. Again, if you have some of that more basic intermediate knowledge, bear with me. I will fairly quickly get to a bit more sophisticated scenarios, but I want to make sure again that we're building gradually. And so the reason that we still carry the name SoftLayer on some of these slides is that you may very well know that quite a while ago IBM acquired SoftLayer, and so these data centers that the IBM Cloud actually consists of still are sometimes referred to as the soft layer data centers, but they are very much IBM Cloud. And the reason that I left this on the slide is as we're starting to talk about networking and how the Power Virtual Server environment, again, that collection of the Power systems themselves, the Power 9 systems, the flash storage, the storage fabric, et cetera, the network fabric, everything redundant, that whole PowerVS environment, or the colo, if you will, how that connects to the rest of the IBM Cloud, you may hear IBMers and others still refer to the IBM Cloud as how it connects to soft layer and the soft layer network. But we want to be very clear. What we're talking about here is how Power Virtual Server connects to the rest of the IBM Cloud. And so what you have here, of course, is a logical representation. So you've got, again, I will call it the rest of the IBM Cloud, which has two flavors, let's just say. It has a classic, or Gen 1 flavor. And it also has, which is characterized as a more typical x86-based cloud, but it also has the Gen 2, or next gen, part of the IBM Cloud, which also includes the capability to have VPC, virtual private clouds. And so all of that is on the left-hand side. And the right-hand side is the PowerVS pod, or colo, or the PowerVS environment. Okay. Now, this, of course, is a logical and network separation. One of the big benefits of the IBM Cloud, of course, is that you're using the very same account and interface, which is cloud.ibm.com, and your account to access all of these services, including Power Virtual Server. So how is Power Virtual Server connected to the rest of the IBM Cloud? Well, it's connected with these single node fibers that each contain many strands that I have plugged in. But at a logical layer, it's connected with redundant connections. So redundant 2 by 5 gigabit links, and those are known as direct link connect. And that is a part that network connection is included in the offering, which is to say there's no additional charge for it. Okay. And think of that connection as the data connection, or as if I'm a client, that is my connection for my data, for my LPAR traffic through the IBM Cloud to get access to the rest of the services and to get access to the internet and to my on-prem environment, as you'll see on the next slide. But just so you know, we also have a different set of connections that connect that the PowerVS environment, or colo, to the rest of the IBM Cloud, and they are referred to as direct link dedicated. And that will be, think of that as the control plane traffic. And so we want to be clear that, for instance, when you're accessing cloud.ibm.com and you're creating an LPAR, well, that's obviously a set of commands that ultimately, through a couple of layers of code, get passed to the PowerVS colo. And in that PowerVS colo, if you're familiar with PowerVC, our on-prem tool that it provides provisioning and automation for Power systems, that is what is ultimately used in the PowerVS colo. But of course, you don't have access to that. You're using cloud.ibm.com. And the way that those commands, that control plane traffic, gets passed to the colo is via that separate set of connections. So that you do have, per account, you do have the 2 by 5 gigabit dedicated links for the LPAR traffic. And that, again, that's the direct link connect. So direct link connect is the one that connects your LPARs in PowerVS to the rest of the IBM Cloud, and through that to the internet. So we do have another logical diagram here that I won't spend so much time on because there's quite a bit that I'd like to cover today, but I want to just show you a couple of scenarios and give you an idea of how these connections work from the internet or my on-premise environment to the Power Virtual Server colo. Because if you have some of these basic ideas, getting into the network scenarios, which is what we're going to do next, will be a bit easier if you don't necessarily have the experience with them. So this picture is divided into 3 sections. At the upper part, I have my on-premise environment, or maybe I'm connecting through the public internet. Okay. Now keep in mind that's where the connection is coming from. We're not using a public IP address necessarily. So the middle part of the middle portion of the slide is again marked soft layer, but that is the IBM Cloud. And then the bottom part of it will be the Power Virtual Server Colo, or the Power Virtual Server environment. And so to very briefly look at some of those basic scenarios of how I would connect, okay? We do have the ability, so let's say, I am customer A, okay? And I would like to get a secure connection, of course, to my environment and to my LPARs that are running in Power Virtual Server, okay? So one way that I would do that is if you're following, in this case, I think it's the black line, but there's a line from customer A, marked the VPN, and connecting down to the VPN. What we're doing is the connection from the on-premise environment is first coming into the IBM Cloud, and it's coming into a VPN service. And the next 2 slides will show 2 different ways of coming into a VPN service. But for now, let's just say that I'm coming from my on-prem environment through the public internet, but of course, this is a secure VPN tunnel, and that VPN tunnel connects to a VPN service in the IBM Cloud. It does not directly connect to Power Virtual Server and the environment. And what you see there from the middle box where it says customer A account and the IBM Cloud Network, we then have these links down into a box called DL Direct Link Connect. And that's that direct link connection that is going to be key for just about all of these network scenarios, because those, again, 2 by 5 gigabit direct link connections from the IBM Cloud to the co-located Power Virtual Server, that is what enables Power Virtual Server to leverage all these other services in IBM Cloud, for example, a VPN service. Okay. Now, one point that I want to make is if you were to look at the red line on the screen, and that's just a color that was selected, I do want to make a point that for the very basic type of connectivity, which is I have my LPAR created in the IBM Cloud, and I would like to get access to the console. So I'm not making an SSH connection or some sort of other protocol connection. I just want to connect to the console. To do that, you don't actually need to create a VPN session or anything else. What you would be doing is you would be using the cloud.ibm.com UI, and you would log in into your account securely, of course, and you should have the right authorities to create LPARs and all of that. And whoever is in the organization is managing that cloud account will give you those authorities. But once you have that, and once you create the LPAR, you can, from the UI, click a button and open a console. And I will show you what that looks like a bit later in the presentation. So I don't want you to think that even just to open a console, you have to have a VPN connection and all these things. But typically, opening the console is that first basic step. You do want some type of network session connection as well. So we'll jump to the network scenarios now. Hopefully, this gives you a basic idea of, for the most part, when you're connecting to the PowerVS environment, co-located with the IBM Cloud, you are connecting through the IBM Cloud. And as we'll discuss a bit later as well, from the PowerVS environment, you very much have connections to what we refer to as IBM Cloud Classic or the Gen 1 Cloud and all of those services. And from PowerVS, you very much can have a connection to the next gen, Gen 2, or the VPC part of the IBM Cloud and that set of services. Now, before I continue, if we direct our attention to the right-hand side of the slide, you will see that there is one method that, if you will, bypasses the rest of the IBM Cloud. And it's actually a couple of different methods, and you'll see them in just another presentation. But just so you know that if I am looking based on my requirements for that LPAR, if I'm looking to have both a more direct as well as a dedicated higher bandwidth, lower latency connection to the PowerVS environment directly, that is an option. And that option would be a network exchange provider like Megaport, and there are others as well, or something called IBM Cloud Connect, which we'll touch on in just a second. So I don't want you to think that you absolutely have to go through the rest of the IBM Cloud, and we do have options that have that really high bandwidth, low latency connections as well. Of course, all these different options have different price tags associated with it. Today is a bit more of a technical presentation, but I just wanted to throw that in there. Now, there are no really good, really simple network diagrams that I've run into, and believe me, I see many of them every day as we work with different clients. Here's what an on-premise environment is and how it connects to the cloud and all of that. So if you've not seen one of these diagrams before, they are available in that cloud documentation knowledge center that I mentioned before. So some of the pictures are from there. If you're not so much familiar with them, this can look quite complicated. It's not, ultimately. And so I will be your guide through this. And if you've already seen some of these, great. So everything, again, is based on what is the type of connectivity that I need. Okay, everything is based on that business requirement. So for instance, if I have the type of application, we'll pick IBM I this time. I have an IBM I LPAR in the cloud. We've moved it there. Not so much today's topic of how that migration works, but that is something that we do, daily, that my team and the Live Services team around the world does. And so we can definitely work with you guys on that. So let's say we've done that, and I have the application up now. It's running on LPAR. It's in PowerVS, Power Virtual Server. So my requirement then is to have a user or a set of users connect via, let's say, Secure 5250 or via some other protocol directly from that user's workstation on premise in her or his desk to the application, the workload that's running in that LPAR and PowerVS. So the way we would do that, if that's the business requirement, and believe me, we will get to side-to-side VPN. That's the next slide. So, but for now, let's just say it's an individual user. So the way we would do that is with a VPN client. And in that knowledge center that I was referring to before, there's a nice section about connecting with VPN and how to download the client and all of that. So the way that would work is there is a 1, 2, 3, 4 steps here. So on the left-hand side of the picture, as you'll see, it is marked. Hopefully you can see the letters a bit small, but it's marked as the enterprise network. And in the enterprise network, kind of in the middle, it says I have a public network. Now, I don't want you to be confused. It doesn't mean that I necessarily have to be out onto the internet or outside of the enterprise network. It just means that as a user using that VPN client, I could be from within my own enterprise, provided, of course, that secure connections are allowed out, not in, of course, but secure connections are allowed out. Or I could be sitting at a coffee shop and connect from there using VPN. That's all we're saying. Okay, this could very much be from the enterprise as long as VPN connections are allowed out. Okay. So I have that client VPN, and so that's the padlock. That's the red circle with the padlock on the left-hand side. So that's the first component. I'm using an Ssl Vpn client that I've downloaded for free. And what I'm connecting to is a VPN service in IBM Cloud Classic, in the IBM Cloud. So the VPN service is not running in PowerVS directly. This is going to be one of those examples of connecting through the IBM Cloud, and that is most of them. So that's the first part, okay? Now, the next component here is that when I connect to that VPN service in the IBM Cloud, I don't immediately, I am not immediately routed into PowerVS. In a bit here, we will talk about GRE tunnels. In this case, we're not talking about GRE tunnels because it's a single user VPN. So what I do have connection to right away is I can create myself a jump server. That could be a Linux VM, could be a Windows VM, but that would be running in IBM Cloud Classic. It would not be running in PowerVS. Now, why do I need that? And the reason for that is the routing is not set up in such a way that it can automatically from that single user VPN connection connects all the way straight into PowerVS. So what I have is I have a jump server from on-prem. After my VPN, I'm connecting to the jump server. Could be a Windows server where I have any client software that I need. Okay, so for instance, if I'm doing an IBMI connection on that jump server, maybe I have IBM Client Access installed. Okay, and then from that jump server, I'm then connecting to the PowerVS Colo, and the way I'm connecting is using that direct link connect, that 2 by 5 gigabit connection that is part of the service, part of the PowerVS service. Okay, so as I go through the scenario, I am trying to go through a bit of when you might use that. So for instance, if I'm looking for multiple different systems on premise to connect to Power Virtual Server and my LPAR is there, obviously that's not the scenario. The next scenario is what we're going to be talking about. But at least maybe when I'm starting, if I have individual users who are connecting with VPN, this scenario does work. Yes, there's a bit of an extra step in there to create the jump server, but that might be a viable solution. Now, this scenario here is, I would say, well, at least when I'm starting, if I'm a client, if I'm starting with Power Virtual Server, if I'm doing a POC of moving 1 or 2 LPARs, doesn't matter if it's AIX or IBMI, and I'll stop saying it, but of course, we're also very much doing SAP HANA and starting to do OpenShift as well, but yeah, mostly I'll be focusing on AIX and I today. So if I'm doing a POC and I'm moving a couple of LPARs, which believe you me, since I work with all of you, and that is how just about everybody starts. This scenario too is where we live most of the time while we're at that stage. Before we've gone to, okay, maybe I'm looking at a few production workloads now, they need the high bandwidth, low latency. That's the next couple of scenarios. But especially, excuse me, especially while I'm starting, this is the scenario that is the most common. Because what this means is I have an IPsec VPN gateway in my on-premise environment, and I'm connecting to an IPsec VPN gateway service in IBM Cloud. Okay, so now what you see is the enterprise network is still on the left, but now I'm not necessarily looking at these individual users. I'm looking at subnets. I'm looking at well-defined subnets that are using that IPsec VPN gateway to then connect to the peer gateway VPN service, which is still not running directly in Power Virtual Server. It is running in IBM Cloud Classic. I say that if you happen to have a connection to IBM Gen 2, if you have a connection to VPC, if you're using the VPN as a service connection through VPC and not through IBM Classic, it's the same concept. So don't think that if you happen to have a VPN connection to VPC, somehow you can't use it to get to PowerVS. You can. Okay, so same concept. So now we have a bit of the same challenge that we did before, which is just because we have a secure tunnel from the on-premise environment, it doesn't necessarily mean that that traffic from all those systems on-premise, those subnets, is automatically routed into Power Virtual Server. For that, we're going to need an edge router or an edge gateway. Sometimes it's known as a virtual router appliance as well, or a VRA. But the type of service that, if I'm doing this, that I'm ordering from IBM Cloud is going to be either a Viata or Viata, your preferred way to say that service, or a Juniper VSRX service. And the purpose of that virtual router appliance, or edge gateway, if you will, is to do the routing from the IPsec VPN peer gateway that you're connecting to into our virtual server, and your private, dedicated, no one else can see them. This is obviously a secure cloud environment into your private subnets in PowerVS. What is the actual mechanism for the packets to go from the VPN peer gateway on-premise, then it gets into the VPN gateway in either in IBM Cloud Classic or in VPC Gen 2, and then through the router, how do they get those packets to Power Virtual Server? Maybe this will be the last time I say it. We're using that direct link connect between Power Virtual Server and either Gen 2 VPC or the IBM Cloud Classic. So hopefully you're starting to get the idea that if I'm doing PowerVS, I don't want to say 100% of the time, but just about all the time, you will need, somebody may come up with an example where you don't need it, and maybe I'm using Megaport directly to PowerVS or something like that. But most of the time, you will need that direct link connect service, because in addition to the on-premise connection, again, that's what you're using for the LPARs in PowerVS to also leverage all those other services in IBM Cloud, and maybe it's Watson or some of the AI services, or maybe you've got workloads that are x86 workloads in VPC or in IBM Cloud Classic. So hopefully I've convinced you to directly connect, which again, it's included with the offering. You're not paying for it separately. That will be necessary. So the reason that this is the most common scenario, at least when we're getting started, is that what we have found over the last year or so is that rarely is it enough to have that individual user VPN. What we found is working with some of you is we may think that that's sufficient, but before too long, it turns out that there are also applications and other systems that need to connect to the LPARs in PowerVS. And we're then off to configure the IPsec site-to-site VPN. I will mention, I think people are familiar with VPN in general, I will mention that keep in mind that this is a secure connection, and of course you can have, and most people will have a firewall nevertheless on the on-prem environment, and only certain ports will be allowed, and of course, even though it's a VPN tunnel, of course that's still in there. So it's a secure connection, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a high bandwidth connection. It is over the internet. So keep that in mind as we're talking about advantages and disadvantages. All right. Now, we do have a number of you who have already been using the IBM Cloud for x86 workloads, VMware, could be container clusters as well, could be just x86, Linux, Windows, okay? If that is the case, and I've got an existing connection to the IBM Cloud, if I have what we call a direct link connection, now, you will bear with me, I hope, because we do have several network concepts and types of connections that include the words direct link. And that's maybe a bit of a disadvantage on our part, but that is what they're called today. So this direct link that you're seeing, that's the step one over here, that dotted line. That is not the direct link connect that is connecting IBM Cloud, either Classic or VPC, to PowerVS. This is an on-prem direct link connection to an existing connection to the IBM Cloud. Okay. So if I have that direct link connection, let's call it, even though it's not officially called it, let's call it the external on-premise type to cloud type of direct link. If I have that, yes, I can very much leverage that, because that has already given me the connection into IBM VPC / Gen 2 or into IBM Cloud Classic. And from there, I think you'll recognize the steps from the last discussion. From there, I would have an edge router or an edge gateway or a virtual router appliance, your favorite terminology, which could be a Juniper VSRX again, or a Viata Viata service that would do the routing for me to Power Virtual Server. Now, there was a comment on the last slide. I didn't make it. I'll make it on this slide, though, that we will talk about GRE tunnels for just a second here. And the reason we will is that If I'm looking to bring my own IP, so that's the bring your own IP, the BYO IP that we've mentioned here. The subnets from on-premise are not automatically advertised with the Viata, or Juniper VSRX. And so if I wanted to bring my own IP, I would need a GRE tunnel in addition to this connection that we're showing up here in order to bring my own IP. And so what's the what's a more business way of stating that? So the way we typically hear that stated is, if I wanted to extend my on-prem network into, this is not the only way to do that, don't get me wrong, but if I want to extend my on-prem network into my private subnets in PowerVS and bring my own IP, in addition to what we're talking about here, we would be configuring a GRE tunnel. This scenario, and maybe I should have left the comment for this scenario, but this is exactly as the last one. Only in this case, we also have a GRE tunnel, and I'm bringing my own IP. And I realize now that I should probably move it along a bit. So I will show one more scenario here. And that is the high bandwidth, low latency scenario. So the way we do that is, and you may very well be familiar with them, but they're a network exchange. Sometimes they're called, network cloud providers. Megaport is probably the largest one, but not the only one, that already have established connections from their own network data centers to the major cloud providers, such as the IBM Cloud, AWS, Google, etc. And so then if I'm looking for that high-speed dedicated connection that's not going over the public internet, then what I'm doing is I am purchasing a connection from my data center to Megaport. Then from Megaport to the IBM Cloud, that connection is already established. So it's the last mile, even though it's not technically a mile or 1.5 kilometers. It's the last mile connection from my data center to Megaport that I'm purchasing, and there's a nice order process that you would go through and all of that. And then there's still some routing that we would do to then connect through from the on-premise to Megaport, from Megaport to the IBM Cloud, which is an existing connection, but you're getting your own private connection, and from there to PowerVS. In North America, if you're dialing in from the US, we do also have a service called IBM Cloud Connect that is similar, but not using Megaport. Turns out that network topics do take a bit to go through, so I will kind of move it along just a bit here. And we do have enough time, and I think if we leave 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end, I think that'll be okay. And if you've got further questions, you have my email in the beginning to ask me questions. I did want to mention, since I've been talking about Direct Link, I did want to mention Direct Link Connect. I did want to mention that we are also rolling out, and this is an ever-expanding list of which data centers and which colos have the Direct Link 2.0. A couple of important characteristics of Direct Link 2.0. So it allows connections to both IBM Cloud Classic and the Gen 2 VPC. It also allows multiple connections to multiple accounts under the same direct link. And so if I'm a client, but I'm using more than one account, you can now connect between the different accounts. And people sometimes want that for security, license purposes, and so on. I can connect to more than one account with the same direct link 2.0. It can also be metered now or unmetered when you're creating it and when you're requesting it. Keep in mind that is this type of connection, Direct Link 2.0, Direct Link Connect 2.0, still included with the PowerVS offering. So let me now share, always a good topic, and of course that somewhat scratches the surface of it, but let's move a bit to running my Power workloads in Power Virtual Server. And I'll share a few concepts with you where again, if you've played with this already, you know them. But if you don't necessarily have the experience, I'll share a few concepts with you that are useful to know. So these are some screenshots that I took from just running in Power Virtual Server. So I'm in the IBM Cloud, and I'm looking at the catalog of services. And the service that you're looking for is called Power Systems Virtual Server. You can just start typing Power up in the catalog after you log into IBM Cloud. And you can find that service. And so if you were to click on it, you can start provisioning a Power Virtual Server service. Now, if you don't have the experience, that's really largely why I'm sharing this, is I have two tips for you at this step. So the first one is the PowerVS service is not the LPAR. The PowerVS service is the collection of LPARs that you're going to create. And so you may have a collection of LPARs since Jody is hosting this. So you may have a collection of LPARs in, let's say, one of the London data centers, but maybe you have a collection of LPARs also in a Frankfurt data center, or could be the Tokyo one, right? So that collection of LPARs is the service. So you're creating that service almost as a collection of the LPARs, as an umbrella that holds the LPARs. That's the first tip. The second tip, very, very important, applies to all of us here. Whether I'm a client, I'm a partner, I'm an IBMer, right? It's a bit of a, you don't necessarily can read everything on the slide, so you just have to take my word for it if you've not been on this slide. But as you're creating this service, on the right-hand side, there's a black section with a blue bar at the bottom as well. Lets you do something really important, and that is estimate. Estimate the cost of running a Power Virtual Server service with a given number of LPARs based on OS, AX, IBM, SAP HANA, etc. You can estimate what the monthly charges would be. And so this is very, very useful for all of us that have managers. I think it's probably all of us here. And if there are any CEOs here, great, we can maybe estimate to your board, right? But very useful to be able to estimate to your management. Okay, here's what the monthly cost for this LPAR with this much CPU, this version of the OS would cost. And you can do that before you've ordered, before you've deployed any LPARs. So before you've spent any money, you can estimate what it would cost. So very handy. So once you have the service created, the next thing that you would create before you can deploy LPARs would be subnets. So each of those subnets is private to you. So if I'm a client, each of them, I'm in my account. These are subnets that only I can see, of course. Each one is a separate VLAN that belongs just to me. I will spare you the details of how that's actually configured in the PowerVS colo. But separate, completely secure, independent subnets, and those are private. Now you may choose, when you assign an LPAR and you assign it an interface on a private subnet, by default, it will not have a public internet-facing IP address. You may choose to do that, but unless you explicitly also assign it an externally facing IP address, it will not have one, which most of the time, or just about all the time, that's what you want. You wouldn't necessarily want an IP address that is directly accessible on the public internet. You want a private IP address that then you're connecting to using one of the methods that we talked about just a little while ago. So you're creating a subnet. The reason you're creating a subnet, one or more, is when we're going to go deploy a LPAR next, it will ask you what subnet it should have an interface on. So a few screens on the subnet. And then the next tip, if you're a power person like me, in the long time ago, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't necessarily know the term VSI, and I'll share the term VSI with you, and it just stands for Virtual Server Instance. So when you're creating an LPAR, it's a VSI. And that VSI is being created in your service, in your collection of LPARs. And each service has a data center or colo associated with it. So that's why, again, you may have a service in Toronto, and maybe you have a service in Sao Paulo. So when you're creating an LPAR, it's a VSI, virtual server instance. And so you may see things like create an instance. That's the deployment of the LPAR. Other than that, it's pretty simple. When I'm just logged into my IBM Cloud, when I'm on the dashboard, the very first thing top left that I can click on is my resource list. And that lists all the different services I'm using. Power Virtual Server, x86, VPC, other network services. You remember those Junipers and Viatas that we talked about earlier? Maybe Cloud Object Storage, they're all listed there. And so you click on the Power Virtual Server service, my collection of LPARs, and here's an example of a Power Virtual Server service, PowerVS service that has a whole bunch of LPARs, but when you're first starting, it will have none. And there's a nice blue button towards the top right that says Create Instance. And that lets you start creating instances or deploying LPARs. And that will put up a nice screen here where you can give the new virtual server instance, or LPAR, a name. You can select what the resources are going to be. So CPU memory, you can select obviously which OS and what version of the OS, and that will deploy a generic image. Right away, if you didn't know already, let me say here that of course you can bring your own images from on-premise and make them available in the drop-down menu when you're provisioning new LPARs later on. Okay. So again, other options, are you going to install some additional software? There are additional components of the OS. So for instance, if you're doing, I believe I have a comment, I do. For instance, if you're deploying IBM I LPARs, in order for that IBM I LPAR to be doing backups in the cloud and using our IBM Cloud Object Storage, or COS, as where to store the backups, you will need backup recovery and media services, BRMS, and you will also need cloud storage solutions, which is abbreviated ICC. And when you're selecting those packages, all that means is we're also injecting license keys into IBM I for those packages as well. But in general, in case you didn't know, so Power Virtual Server is an infrastructure as a service offering. So what's included in the monthly charge is the use of the server, Power 9, scale up or scale out, the use of the server, flash storage, SAN fabric, network fabric environment, the maintenance of that, and there's a certain SLA, service level agreement, that we have, and also the OS. And then any applications on top of that, you would bring your own licenses. Okay. So as you're creating that, it is also populating on the right-hand side of how much that will cost per month. Those are monthly charges. More tips from Vess if you didn't know that before. So those are monthly charges for the LPARs that are up and running with the CPU and memory that you selected. Yes, you can be quite granular in selecting CPU and memory. You can choose capped. You choose uncapped shared processors, and you can also choose dedicated processors. And it's not going to surprise you to find out that those all have different costs associated with them. Okay, so you can estimate what the monthly charges are. Those charges do get calculated every 24 hours, but you do get a monthly charge. If you create an LPAR and it's up and running, obviously it will be metered every 24 hours. If you shut the LPAR down, it will continue to be metered. So shutting the LPAR down doesn't remove the charge from it. You would have to delete the LPAR. Let's say it's a test LPAR, right? Not deleting production LPARs. But if it's a test LPAR, you would have to delete it before it's not included in the next 24-hour metering of the charges that then you get charged for monthly. So here's a little tip. All right, so the next part, as we said, is you are attaching this LPAR to one or more subnets, and you may choose an IP address out of that subnet, and you chose what the range of IP addresses is earlier when you're creating the subnet, or you can just have the next one assigned, okay? Notice that the ability to assign a publicly facing interface that matches, that goes with the private interface, is selected to be off by default. So it's not selected by default. Okay. And you want to be careful when you're turning that option on, because again, that gives you an internet-facing IP address, which most of the time you probably don't want to have. So a bit of discussion on, so that's how you get started essentially, with hopefully some tips, useful tips from me. And then a bit of discussion on what does it look like if I'm an admin, if I'm a Power admin, and I'm managing my LPARs in Power Virtual Server. So here's an example of a PowerVS service called PowerVS SLS. That's in the top left-hand side of the screenshot. And when I took the screenshot, it looks like this service had 3 LPARs in it, and it looks like there were both AIX and IBMI ones. So they're up and running. Okay. Now, what are some of the common admin tasks that you may perform? The first one will be changing the CPU and memory. So we may call that on Power, we may call that DLPAR for dynamic LPAR changes. How would you do that? You would click on the LPAR itself, and towards the right-hand side on the top, there's a little button you can click called Edit the Details of the Virtual Server Instance, or the LPAR. And from there, you can change the entitled capacity, you can change the memory. If you're used to looking at the HMC, so this is the changing the entitled, you're not changing the mins and maxes here. Okay, you can see what the mins and maxes are. Can you change the mins and maxes? Yes, but that would require rebooting the LPAR, just like in the HMC. Okay. Is there an HMC ultimately managing this LPAR behind the scenes? There is. Yes, we happen to use Novolink actually to manage the LPARs, but the HMC for more of the hardware management. Now you'll notice that towards the top, there's an option called VM pinning. And what this means is the LPAR will be pinned to a particular power system in PowerVS. Now, if we're looking at licenses, you're always going to get a serial number so that then you can apply that license to it. But it may be that during maintenance and so on, the team that's managing this environment may use LPM, Live Partition Mobility, to move the LPAR temporarily to a different system while they're doing maintenance and all that. And of course, that's not going to affect the workload. If you didn't want that to happen, for license reasons and other, you could choose to pin the VM, and then of course you'd get a notification from IBM support, and you would have to work with them on how and when this LPAR may be moved or not based on what maintenance needs to be done. If you have started running out of disk and you wanted to add more disk to that LPAR, you can do that on the fly. You're in the LPAR itself. By the way, all of these actions are happening on that same screen where I just clicked on the LPAR, my virtual server instance, and now I'm just looking at different components of a large screen, and I just didn't want to take one tiny screenshot. So if I'm looking to add disk, I'm in the LPAR, I click on the Add Disk button at the top right, very easy. And here, as you can see, I can add volumes of size up to 2 terabytes per volume. Be clear that it's not total of 2 terabytes. You can have a lot of storage, just 2 terabytes per volume. You would name the volumes, not that you would ever get access to that storage, flash storage, but that's what they would be named on the flash storage as well. So you can give them a name. And there'd be identifier, so that it's not exactly the same name for everybody. You give them a name. You can say if they're shareable. Now, shareable volumes would apply to AIX for something like local Power HA. They would not apply to IBMI. Obviously, IBMI doesn't do shared volumes between 2 LPARs. And what this will result in is very quickly, there'll be new volume or volumes created for you and correctly zoned and mapped all the way to the OS. And then in the OS, if it's IBMI, those will show as non-configured drives, and you can add them to the correct ASP, including an independent ASP. If it's AIX, those will show as your next H disk in number. You would have to run a config manager, right? And then they would show up as the next H disk, and then you would add them to the correct volume group. You can add new IP interfaces on the fly as well. You're still on that one big page that lets you manage everything about this LPAR. It's going to give you an idea of the current interfaces. You can attach an existing network. What that means is you're assigning an IP address on that subnet you created to this LPAR. So you're also putting this LPAR on that network as well. Again, that's the private subnet that you manage. So you're picking which network that you're assigning the IP address on. And again, you can pick an IP address that you selected ahead of time, the range for that network. Or you can have the next one assigned that's available. So this is on the fly. It will be correctly configured in both AIX and IBMI. You will just get a new interface that was added for you with the correct IP address. And you can start using it in that OS. Now, I promised to show this earlier, so I will. And that is how to open a console. So all those network scenarios are going to be necessary, at least one of them. But before you do any of those, you can just open a console. You can do that securely right through the browser, okay? So I'm still in the LPAR that I've clicked on, that I'm managing. And up at the top, there's a button to open the console. I'm going to click it. And here's what it looks like based on your preference of operating system. And if you are using IBMI, we do have virtual function keys that go up to function key F24 on the console below. And if you're using AIX, it looks like an AIX console because it is. This is going through from the interface securely all the way down through PowerVC and through NovaLink to the PowerVM hypervisor on that system that's running your AIX LPAR. You can start and shut down the LPAR. The same rules apply as on the HMC. Typically, you don't want to just shut down the LPAR from this interface. You want to do it from the OS, but you can start it from here. All right, so that was a brief view with some tips thrown in there, kind of sharing their experience of some of the network scenarios and when they would be applicable and pros and cons. I also talked a little bit about getting started with the Power Virtual Server and some of the associated concepts. And I gave you a quick view of, if I'm a Power admin, what does my management environment look like? So as you can see, you don't get access to the cloud environment. So there's no access to the HMC, there's no access to the virtual IO servers, there's no access to the storage directly. But before we continue, if you have automation that you have built that uses APIs, you can extend, modify that automation to use the Power Virtual Server set of APIs. Now, I didn't put the link on here, but if you go use that link I shared before with the frequently asked questions in the Knowledge Center, you can scroll down and get to the section that identifies the PowerVS APIs. A bit beyond today's discussion, but suffice it to say that if I'm using some of the automation tools that are popular with all of us now, regardless of OS, such as Terraform or such as Ansible, you can very much use those to manage Power Virtual Server. There is a Terraform provider. And of course, you can create Ansible modules that use that Terraform provider, or you can create Ansible modules and Ansible playbooks that also just call those PowerVS APIs directly. And the beauty here of Power Systems firmly being in the hybrid cloud world is that if, of course, you had the right secure network configuration in place and you had the right authorities, you can have an Ansible playbook, for instance, that calls the OpenStack module to manage your systems on-premise with PowerVC, and also have that same or a different Ansible playbook that uses, let's say, the Terraform provider to create LPARs in PowerVS. So that's a living, breathing example of hybrid cloud that you can do with Power Systems today. Now, I will spend just a couple of minutes to let you know that There are services, if you were to need help with any of this, whether it's moving a workload to PowerVS, the network component of it, managing, right? Lab service wouldn't be providing managed services, so we provide the implementation services. But there are lab services offerings. And so very briefly, I'm actually going to go right past this, but we typically have a planning session called the Cloud Design Workshop where we go through all those good considerations and requirements that I shared with you earlier. And then we would typically have a variable duration, actual Power Virtual Server migration service to move one or more workloads to PowerVS or help you with new workloads. Again, AIX, IBM I, HANA. We do have a service for OpenShift in PowerVS, which again, I didn't touch on today, but that's very much a growing area. And that does mean that you can run OpenShift containers and LPAR-based applications on PowerVS on the same systems at the same time. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop here before we get to the questions. So again, let me invite you. I will scroll all the way up to my first slide just to give you a view of my email address. Again, it's just my first name at bos.ibm.com. To ask any questions, or again, if you didn't know who your local lab services person is to help with this, let me know and I will connect. I will make that connection. But now we will jump with our remaining time. Looks like we do have a good maybe 17 minutes here for questions. So we will jump to questions at this point. And let me go to, yeah, go ahead, Jody.
I was just going to say thanks very much for covering that, Vess. And I just wanted to thank Stuart Cunliffe, Turgut Genç, and also Zoe Devlin, because they have been answering some of the questions in the chat. So our IBM colleagues, thank you very much. So going to the chat, the questions, if we could go to 18 minutes past when we started, you'll see Vince has asked a question about PowerVS. What about PowerVS available on-prem, like IBM Satellite for OpenShift with x86, that kind of thing? So on-prem version.
Yes, and I am trying to find it, but yeah, so I'll just answer the question, then we'll keep going through them. So suffice it to say that it's being considered, it's in the works, and that's all I can share for now. But very good point, and we are also thinking about that, and it's in the works.
Also, Stuart did say that PowerVS is PowerVC OpenStack, and we have PowerVC available on-prem as well, as you were stating earlier, just towards the end of your session as well. Okay, there was a question about slides and will they be available? So just to repeat, this session is being recorded and I will post the replay and the slide deck hopefully later on today, as soon as I can get that sorted. So you will have that available. The next one, IBM I workloads in PowerVS. When or how will IBM going forwards address serial number dependent keys in IBM I? Reasonable to think that virtual keys will be needed. Likewise, how do client address things like crypto cards? How do we handle these in PowerVS environment?
Yeah, several questions in one, and I'm afraid I have to be brief on those just because each one is a bit of a topic. But so let me go through all of that. So the way, yes, virtual keys, it's something else that is being looked at. Yes, that IBM I and license keys and the expiration date on LPPs and so on, that's been an ongoing question for many, many years for IBM I. So in PowerVS, we are looking at virtual keys, and that's all I can say there for now. But the way people are dealing with it today is, so the first thing I did say during my talk a bit, but when you're creating those LPARs, those virtual server instances, they are living on a real either scale out or scale up Power 9 frame. And so they will have a serial number. So now then, it depends on the vendor of, okay, if I have existing licenses for on-premise, can I then transfer them to that new serial number? Often the answer is yes, And sometimes IBM can facilitate that discussion, but it is a discussion between, if I'm a client, between me and my vendor. As I said, most of the time, that serial number won't change. It may change very infrequently, only once in a great while, if there's maintenance required. And as I was saying, there is the VM pinning option, so that if you, such was the agreement with the ISV that you really cannot change serial numbers, then the VM pinning option is there. And then you would work with support if there's any maintenance required on that particular system and so on. So that is how clients are dealing with it today, where they're working with IBM, but also with their vendors on ISVs on applying license keys to that new serial number. As for the crypto card, very briefly, yes, that is obviously a good question. And so there are no crypto cards in those particular systems. So the systems are S922s and E980s. So there are no crypto cards in them. Several of us here, including Stu, have moved the cards on those systems, so we know that. And the way we're dealing with that is obviously working with lab services as well as the Rochester Development Lab. And if I named some of the names, you would recognize them on software-based crypto solutions. So by all means, reach out to us. We've been exploring that with clients, and so we should be able to help in that area.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about the difference between SoftLayer, IBM Cloud, and this IBM Cloud, as it were, but Stuart did answer that already. There was a question about Megaport. Again, I believe we covered that already. Right, here's one that I don't think we've covered. What is the latency difference between VPN, direct link, and direct connectivity to on-prem?
It's significant, right? And so obviously, no, I can't give you any numbers because it vastly depends on your connection from your enterprise over the internet to whatever the closest PowerVS location is for something like site-to-site VPN. But that can be measured. Obviously, we can create a site-to-site tunnel and measure what that latency is, and then that will then help us determine, is that sufficient for application response or for DR type replication, right? And if it's not, then we would get into some of the Megaport options. Does Megaport have published bandwidth and latency numbers? I don't believe so, not in specific locations. They may have general numbers. They will certainly be higher, and then the cost will be higher as well, but I don't think we have specific latency numbers. I could be wrong about Megaport. Maybe they have something published, but I'm not sure.
Okay. The next one that I think we haven't answered is, can the jump, oh no, it has been answered, sorry. Can the jump server be an AIX instance? Stu answered that. It is in IBM Classics, it has to run on x86. And there was a question about multi-factor authentication. Can you set up multi-factor authentication for this Ssl Vpn?
I'm thinking here, we would have to look into that. We've all used the VPN client. By default, it does not do that. So no, actually, I will correct myself. The answer is yes. Yes, we have done that. And that multi-factor authentication will be set up in a combination with the VPN client, but also your workstation. So if you have an RSA key that you're using, can that be used in conjunction with that VPN connection? Yes, we have done that.
Okay. Right, just looking. When would I choose Viata versus VSRX?
It's a matter of, it's a matter of preference. Also a little bit of cost. They're comparable in cost. So think of it this way. So as I was saying, the lab services team that you're talking to, and obviously thanks to Stu and Turgut and everyone else who's been helping, speaking of collaboration between the lab service team. So when you're working with us, we're very much working with you on planning and the implementation, right? But at some point, we are handing off the controls either back to you or a partner, or IBM does offer managed services as well. That's not our team, but obviously we can connect you with the team in IBM that does that, right? And so let's assume for a moment that you're not necessarily going with the managed services. So then the question is, once we have that Viata, or Juniper configured and it's up and running and everything's great, someone does have to maintain it over time and add new routes as needed and all of that, right? So there it goes into the what's the preference of the person maintaining it.
And there was a question which has been answered, but it's worth just stating it. Can scenario 2 be proposed to customers with a small Power Virtual Server footprint, such as 4 to 5 VMs, production workloads? And Stu did, I think, answer yes, you can. It's probably ideally suited, I would say.
And again, so my answer is obviously the same. And Stu, we both, you know, have lots of experience with this now. So the answer is yes, and that's how very much people start. I will, just so we're clear, I will throw in the caveat of if one of those 4 or 5 LPARs has a low latency requirement, that might jump you up into the next tier. But most of the time, the reality is yes, that's what it's suited for.
Okay. Can you use BGP on Direct Link Connect?
So the answer is yes. And I did not want to get into that, but the reality is when those direct links are first being established, those are BGP routes that are being created. Can you create additional ones? Yes.
Okay. Again, I think this one's been answered already. Can I attach or link other IBM Cloud offerings such as x86 or AC922 with GPUs, etc., to my PowerVS infrastructure as a service ecosystem connected to my private enterprise network like PowerVS? And
Yes, one of the biggest values
yeah.
of PowerVS is that you can do that. Yes.
In the cloud services, object storage or data services, etc., in GCP, will this connect or appear in my services? Quite sure what they're asking.
So cloud object storage will definitely appear in the list of services under storage, and hopefully that answers the question.
Mm-hmm. There was a question about VRAs, which Stu has posted a link for that, which I'll include in my useful links section when I send the replay out. Right, there are some questions about cost or estimated cost, but I think people have to just try and see to estimate what particular monthly cost would be, as you showed in the screenshots.
Right, and I'll make just a quick comment there is that you're talking to lab server technical people. Obviously, we work daily with our sales partners, both in systems, in power, and in cloud. And so for things like, you know, what does this look like over 3 years or 5 years? You know, if you don't know who the local salesperson is, we can connect you to him or her as well. So yeah, that's a sales question, and we can connect you.
Okay. There were some other questions which have been answered. I'm just trying to find. Has anyone tried PowerVS with IBM Multi-Cloud Manager?
Every time unless it's something quite obscure, every time a question starts like that, the answer usually is yes. And the answer is yes in this case. And so, yes, this is very much, as I was saying, the power systems are living and breathing in the hybrid cloud. That is one of the many scenarios that we're talking about. So yes, you would use the Cloud Pak for Multi-Cloud Manager, and specifically the CloudForm/Manage IQ part of that will allow you to then, of course, after having the right network connections and having to make sure you've got the right token obtained and all that, after you've done that, yes, that will let you have that single dashboard of having LPARs in the cloud and LPARs on premise and the containers kind of on one Manage IQ/CloudForms part of the Cloud Pak for Multi-Cloud Management. So yes.
Okay. Is it on the roadmap that we could buy a shared processor pool to cap Oracle licenses?
To buy a shared processor pool, it's being investigated. Yeah, I would leave it at that. It's not an easy challenge to solve because this is a fully cloud multi-tenant, secure multi-tenant environment. Today, one way that we're dealing with that is, of course, to use capped. Yes, that has certain performance implications. So it's being investigated. That's the best I can say to that. But yes, issue that people are very much aware of. Sorry, Jody.
That's okay. And there was a question about what technology is behind the storage, and Stuart's answered that. It's NPIV.
Very much so. Everything is redundant and yep.
Right.
At every level.
Can we do, for example, an SSH from my on-prem enterprise ecosystem into my PowerVS, I'm assuming PowerVS server directly?
By using one of those scenarios, not quite directly. The only exception would be if you put a truly internet-facing public IP address on the LPAR, and then SSH would be the only port that would be open. Everything else would be firewalled. So while that's possible, again, I wouldn't recommend leaving a publicly facing IP address. Instead, you would want to use one of the secure options that we went through, whether it's individual VPN or site-to-site.
Okay, is there a calculator estimator for the different connectivity like you get for PowerVS configuration?
Not one that's in the, so first off, if you wanted to just go see what a Viata or a VSRX, what the monthly charge for that is just a service. You can go very easily see in the catalog what that would cost. But as far as the overall, let's say Megaport or something like that, there isn't one that's part of the UI. That is, again, something that the IBM sales team can help with. They're very used to that.
Mm-hmm. Are the colos in the UK government approved for official, sensitive and maintained data sovereignty?
Interesting question. That I don't know. So that maybe Stu, maybe you've looked into that. I've not, but if not, send me an email and I know whom to forward this question to. Yeah, that's a good legal question.
Okay, sounds good. Okay.
And Jody, I have to apologize. I do have to break away in just a bit here for another presentation, but yeah, we can answer maybe a couple of questions as we close.
Okay. I'll tell you what, I will capture all the remaining questions and send them to you, and then we can include a link to some answers after the point, which might be a better thing because we have come to the top of the half hour, as it were. So well, thank you very much, Vess, for taking us through that. Thank you to the IBM team for answering the questions via the chat, and thank you to all our participants for joining us today. The next session is going to be in April, and it's IBM I related session, Admin Runtime Expert, ARE, and Dawn May will be delivering that. So I hope you can join us for that. Thank you so much for joining us today, and sorry if we didn't get to your specific question, but we'll do our best to get answers to those. Thanks again, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.